Welcome back, Trailblazers! This is episode 7 of our Honkai Star Rail Amphoreus journey, and boy do we have a lot to cover this time around. In this patch, we finally got to learn the true origins of Merchant Cyrene, the identity of Evernight, and we even got to meet Terravox for the first time while helping Don Heng reconcile his grievances with his past life, all while making some good headway in saving Amphoreus and launching a proper defense against Iron Tomb's birth. That's quite the list, so let's not waste any more time, shall we? As per usual, I will be summarizing the events of the previous episode briefly before getting into the meat of this one, so without further ado, here's what happened previously on Amphoreus. After witnessing Phinon's sacrifice, the Trailblazer promised to assume the role of Worldbearer and enter the final cycle of Amphoreus with the intent to bring about a new form of Era Nova, one where Iron Tomb doesn't escape and destroy the cosmos, or Noose. The two are kind of linked at this point. And as the cycle reset, Mem fused with the next cycle's Cyrene, which allowed her to recover, or at least retain, all of her memories from this last cycle. So we're still chilling with our best buddy Mem here, but she just has a new body. But there's no time to relax and figure things out, because there's only 14 system hours left until Iron Tomb completes its self-coronation via Era Nova. Fortunately, Herta has a plan to prevent this from coming to pass. She suggests that we could take advantage of this new bug in the system that Phinon created with his sacrifice and rewrite the true purpose of Era Nova. If Iron Tomb can't make use of Era Nova, then it can't escape, and if it can't escape, it can't destroy Noose, and if it can't destroy Noose, it can't destroy the cosmos. So overall, seems like a pretty good plan. The only problem is that this plan requires administrative access to the scepter system that runs Amphoreus, and that access is tied directly to the authority of law. So if we want to rewrite the purpose of Era Nova, we're gonna need to cooperate with the Chrysos heir of law, which is Ceredra. But we're not the only ones who need her cooperation. Lygus also needs it. Despite being a system administrator himself, his permissions are also tied to her authority, and he's already a few steps ahead of us. In fact, Ceredra seems quite swayed by Lygus's proposal of using Iron Tomb as a means of conquering the universe and is quite skeptical of the Trailblazer and Cyrene's intentions. She humors them anyway and invites them to a pre-battle banquet where she seizes all of their belongings, including Screwlum's chronocognitive anchor. This could have gone very badly very quickly, but Ceredra's most trusted companion, Hycelens, is very wary of Lygus and immediately sides with the Trailblazer, which is partly why Ceredra declares all of them traitors later on in the banquet. Now, Lygus assumes that this turn of events means that he has Ceredra's approval. So without warning, he warps the Trailblazer off to the Exomyth, thinking Ceredra would approve. But instead, it just pisses her off, so she uses the chronocognitive anchor to summon Herta and Screwlum and demands to see a demonstration of this power of paths that they possess. Lygus probably assumed that the Trailblazer would never escape the Exomyth, as they don't really have any powers that would allow them to do so. However, they do have a bit of an ally in the form of Evernight, who not only helps them escape, but also gives them the coreflame of world-bearing that Cyrene had apparently hidden somewhere in the River of Time, and then she sends them back to Amphoreus without any further explanations. Which is where things get a little bit weird, because apparently time does not move the same inside of the Exomyth as it does inside of Amphoreus. That hour or so that the Trailblazer spent in the Exomyth was actually 1,000 years in Amphoreus. So the current cycle was basically almost over. The Trailblazer follows a memory that Cyrene left behind for them, and listens as she explains everything that happened during that 1,000-year period, which includes the fate of every Chrysos heir. She also notably explains that Ceredra never actually intended to work with Lygus, and instead had decided to sacrifice herself in order to use her authority over the system's ultimate protocol to not just grant Herta and Screwlum access permissions to the scepter, but to also add a small amendment to the Era Nova conditions. To quote, "If Era Nova's progress becomes abnormal, ignore all variables, terminate the extrapolation, and wait for Iron Tomb to form." To put it in layman's terms, if the system detects any changes to Era Nova that will affect the development of Iron Tomb in unexpected ways, allow them to proceed. She basically removed the safety mechanisms here. But this change to the protocol, as small as it may seem, should provide the Trailblazer with the opportunity to manipulate Iron Tomb's final form by rewriting the purpose of Era Nova, which also happens to be Herta's plan, the one that she told us about earlier. So that's convenient. Anyway, most of the Chrysos heirs perished during the last 1,000 years, with a few notable exceptions. Anaxa, for example, used alchemy to transmute himself into a ghostly form capable of venturing deeper into the system, including spaces like the Exomyth, which exist outside of Amphoreus. And we're gonna come back to his delightful little plan in a bit. Hycelen's also survived the last 1,000 years, but only as a guard to the pathway to the Vortex of Genesis, ensuring that Lygus couldn't reach it until the Trailblazer returned. So when they do return, she finally opens the gate to the Vortex, which allows both the Trailblazer and Lygus to enter, but only one shall be able to leave. And no one wants it to be Lygus. So Hycelens and the Trailblazer fight Lygus's avatar in order to distract him long enough for Cyrene to enact her plan. Because yeah, she's still technically around. And with the assistance of the geniuses and Sunday's tuning ability, Cyrene is able to use the power of Remembrance to trick Lygus's inorganic mind into processing recursive memory loops in order to coerce Lygus into negotiations with his fellow Genius Society members. Because the big reveal of this patch is that he's actually the very first Genius Society member, Xandar 1 Kuwabara. And he's also the creator of Noose, who he hates and wants to destroy. Anyway, they trap him in the exomyth, and with Lygus out of the picture, the Trailblazer can finally offer up the coreflame of world-bearing to the Vortex of Genesis and recreate Amphoreus from their memories. But things don't go exactly to plan, and for once, it's not actually Lygus's fault. Because as we start the quest of this current patch and the Trailblazer attempts to reset the world, they realize that Cyrene's recap of the last 1,000 years did not include any mention of the Chrysos Heir of Time, nor did it mention the Coreflame of Time being returned to the Vortex at all. And that's when Evernight appears to elaborate on this unexpected turn of events, which I am going to embellish with further details to avoid confusion. So during the last cycle, Evernight had in her possession both the Coreflame of World-Bearing and Time. So while it looked like she gave the Trailblazer the Coreflame of World-Bearing, she had actually tampered with the Trailblazer's memories and made them think that the Coreflame of Time was the Coreflame of World-Bearing. So that's why the Coreflame that the Trailblazer offered up to the Vortex of Genesis in this particular case was actually the Coreflame of Time and not World-Bearing. Now Evernight could have given us both Coreflames back when she extracted us from the exomyth. She is technically on our side after all, but she also has her own ideas about how Era Nova should go down. And so she decided to inherit the authority of time in order to tinker with Era Nova herself. Hence why she only gave us one of the Coreflames and not the right one. With Time's authority, she believes that she can use the Reign of Sensation and the power of Oblivion to filter the Trailblazer's memories at her own discretion in order to ensure a more perfect outcome for Amphoreus' future. In other words, she still intends for the world to be reborn using the Trailblazer's memories, just only the memories that she says they can use. Now, as for her motivations, well, we're gonna need a little bit of context for that. Like, we're gonna need to know who or what Evernight is. Now, technically speaking, Evernight and March are the same person. But to use their own words, March is more like the person Evernight always wanted the world to believe she was, while Evernight was all of the aspects of herself that March wanted to keep hidden. So they're two sides of the same coin. Now, the reasons for this split are related to March's true identity as one of Fuli's children, which we're going to talk more about later on. But I kind of have to bring it up here because Evernight represents March's full power over the Remembrance, which she has because of her identity as one of Fuli's children. She's essentially an emanator of the Remembrance. Now, because Evernight and March are the same person, Evernight only wants to protect March and fulfill her desires, and March's greatest desire is to travel the cosmos forever with her companions. So Evernight will do anything in her power to make sure that wish comes true, even if that means resorting to some rather extreme methods to make it happen. For this reason, and also because March doesn't want to be discovered by the Garden of Recollection, for reasons that we'll also get into later, Evernight only comes out in dire situations, and March found herself in a pretty dire situation on Amphoreus. See, March's consciousness arrived on Amphoreus long before the Trailblazer or Don Heng showed up, but she was in a ghostly state and she couldn't really interact with the world directly. This intangible state could have been due to how she entered Amphoreus, or it could be because the scepter system mistook March for Cyrene since they are both children of Fuli, hence why her arrival location was deep inside of the Great Tomb, where Cyrene always ends up after Phynon kills her, but more on that later. I'm personally partial to this explanation because I also think the similarities that March and Cyrene share explain why they both are compatible with the Coreflame of Time. Anyway, March spent 97 days traveling through Amphoreus alone, which is likely why all of the Amphoreus tutorials feature March instead of the Trailblazer. She was there first. And through her travels, she tried to interact with the people of Amphoreus with minimal success. I mean, they couldn't see or hear her, but she did manage to influence some small legends and myths, which probably fed into that whole Rosie Celestial Maiden legend that the Trailblazer sparked later on. And March was even able to help Tribios escape Yanissopolis. Not only does March's interference solve this mystery, but it also gives us an idea of how long ago March arrived in Amphoreus, because that whole deal with Tribios happened a long time before the Trailblazer and Don Heng actually showed up. In Amphoreus time, that is. Anyway, after spending so much time alone, March awakened Evernight, recalling how they'd met once before when Argenti visited the Astral Express. This act of self-reflection made her realize that the time inside of Amphoreus moves differently than it does outside of Amphoreus, so the Trailblazer and Don Heng should be entering the Scepter's orbit soon. But she'd also realized that Amphoreus is both a digital and mimetic world that's protected by a very powerful firewall that March had bypassed subconsciously by using the power of Remembrance. Her companions don't have that power, and Cyrene had already warned her before she entered that no one can pass safely through that firewall, at least not without emanator level powers. March didn't want anything bad to happen to her friend, so she decided to let Evernight take over so they could use the power of Remembrance to allow the minds of Don Heng and the Trailblazer to enter Amphoreus safely while their bodies remained outside of the Scepter's orbit. Now remember, Evernight only wants to protect March and fulfill her greatest wish to travel the cosmos with her companions forever. Iron Tomb's ability to destroy the cosmos after self-coronation and being stuck inside Amphoreus are factors preventing this wish from coming true, so Evernight now intends to fix both problems her own way. And that's how we got here. So Evernight takes over Time's authority and uses it to drown the Trailblazer within a Memoria tide in order to keep them tucked away and safe while she takes care of things outside, which leads to some very trippy experiences for the Trailblazer. She also makes it possible for Black Swan and Fourth Mirror to ensure that Don Heng makes it back to the Astral Express, if only as a projection of his consciousness, since both he and the Trailblazer's bodies are still aboard the detached train car that's orbiting Amphoreus. Don Heng takes this opportunity to assess the situation outside of Amphoreus. During this time, Black Swan explains that some of her Memo Keeper colleagues are not as proper about their memory collecting as she is, and there's this particular group of 42-ish Memo Keepers that aren't really after Amphoreus specifically, but they seem to be after a certain memory located inside of Amphoreus. Black Swan describes this memory as one of a path disappearing, or the memories of a god's death. She goes on to explain how the people of the Garden of Recollection believe that after the universe is destroyed, Fuli will recreate the universe from all of the memories that they have accumulated over time. And since Amphoreus is like a miniature version of the universe, this particular faction of Memo Keepers is trying to use it as a testing ground to prove out their hypothesis. That's a lot of information, but we're gonna come back to it later. And with all that in mind, Don Heng decides that the best course of action for the time being is to return to Amphoreus in order to track down March and the Trailblazer personally. He's kind of useless just sitting here on the Express after all. We're gonna come back to Don Heng in a bit, but there's a lot of stuff that happens kind of concurrently at this point in time. So let's rewind slightly and talk about what happened to Cyrene. Because if you recall from the very beginning of this quest, Cyrene was last seen in the Exomyth trying to negotiate with Lygus. But she disappeared mid-negotiations, and the reason she disappeared is because she sensed that something was going wrong with the Trailblazer in the Vortex of Genesis. This was the moment when Evernight was sucking the Trailblazer into the Memoria tide, which is apparently just Amphoreus' memory zone, and Cyrene had arrived a bit too late to prevent it from happening. So she goes back and asks the geniuses and Sunday for help, and together they're able to both locate the Trailblazer and try to hide them away from Evernight and other parts of the Trailblazer's memories within the memory zone. But in doing so, they accidentally uncover a memory of the Trailblazer's birth, I guess, on the Herta space station, and they also get to recall some forgotten cautionary words from Kafka. I don't really want to address those words right now, so I'm not going to. But while that's going on, Cyrene realizes that Evernight's memo sprites have been pursuing them and decides to lure them away from where Sunday and the Trailblazer are, because Sunday is still trying to extract the Trailblazer while Cyrene is hiding them from Evernight. And as she's luring them away, she manages to uncover the memory of March 7th's camera that's been tucked away in a corner of the memory zone. But then she discovers it's not just a camera, it's also what's left of March 7th, an iridescent memo sprite. So while she's doing that, Sunday finally manages to reharmonize the Trailblazer's swirling memories with his tuning ability, which breaks Evernight's Memoria illusions and allows the Trailblazer to wake up from this forced dream that she's put upon them. But despite his best efforts and skills, Evernight tracks them down and overwhelms him with her Memoria tide, sucking the Trailblazer back into the depths of the memory zone in the process. You're pretty good, Sunday, but you're not good enough to go up against an emanator, apparently. But Sunday's efforts weren't completely useless. They not only allowed Sunday to confirm the status of March and the Trailblazer with his own eyes, but they also served as a smokescreen for Black Swan to enter Amphoreus' memory zone undetected, at least for a little while. We'll come back to those memories that she encounters when she first enters later on, but it doesn't really take long for Evernight to catch up with her. But while Evernight is preoccupied with telling Black Swan her plans while also holding her hostage, the geniuses help Dan Heng's consciousness re-enter Amphoreus. Now, unlike Sunday, Dan Heng is very ill-equipped to extract the Trailblazer from the memory zone, so Screwlim has enlisted additional help from Lygus. As the system administrator, Lygus is actually the best equipped to counter Evernight's shenanigans. And lucky for us, there's no need to fear his betrayal this time. You remember how Anaxa used alchemy to transmute his soul into one that could transcend the boundaries of Amphoreus? Well, he decided to use that newfound state of his to make himself at home inside of Lygus's circuits, just like Circe's had done to him previously. So Anaxa is going to be keeping Lygus in check, although I'm pretty sure Lygus would have had no problem lending a hand here even without Anaxa being lodged in his brain. Because to Lygus, both Evernight and the Astral Express are hindering his projects, and if they want to fight each other, that's in his best interest. So Lygus leads Dan Heng to Kaslana, claiming that the only power capable of ripping through the Memoria Tide is the raw power of destruction. And Kaslana is just kinda chilling near Kefali for reasons I honestly don't quite understand, but regardless, he's nihilistic and unwilling to help until the spirit of Phynon shows up to imbue him with some much-needed optimism. And once the two fuse together, they blow a massive hole in the side of the Great Tree of Knowledge in the Grove of Epiphany, revealing the entrance to the center of the Earth where Evernight is allegedly holding the Trailblazer hostage within her Memoria Tide. Now, although Lygus has upheld his end of the bargain, he has omitted some details about the core of his experiment, like the existence of the Demiurge matrix, which we're gonna come back to later, like a dozen other things I've mentioned at this point. Anyway, Dan Heng runs off on his own and runs into Geocles, the Mountain Breaker, who is pretending to be Terravox, the Chrysos heir of Earth. And he wants Dan Heng's power over the path of permanence so that he can preserve all living things of the Earth that weren't born of Kefali. So like anything non-human. This plan was apparently suggested to him by Evernight, who basically wanted to use him and Terravox as a sort of guardian to mask her location within the memory zone beneath the Earth. But being so close to the memory zone causes some of Dan Heng's own repressed memories to manifest in front of him, specifically memories of his previous life as Dan Feng, who decides to accompany Dan Heng as a sort of ghostly escort and counsel through the memory zone. Along the way, the two encounter the residual memories of Tribi and Hycelins, as well as a lot of manifestations of both Dan Feng and Dan Heng's memories aboard the Luo Fu. They even encountered Dan Feng's memories of Yingxing before he became Blade and Jing Liu before she became Mara struck. This scene takes place right before a terrible battle that killed Dan Feng's friend Bai Heng. I've made a whole video about this incident, but like the TLDR is that Dan Feng was so distraught over the loss of one of his dearest friends that he decided to use the transmutation arcanum to try and bring Bai Heng back to life. Yingxing was his accomplice, but his assistance only got him corrupted by the power of the abundance and forced to become immortal, which is how he became Blade. Jing Liu and Jing Yuan also struggled with the aftermath of Dan Feng's choices, and eventually Dan Feng was essentially executed by being forced into a molting rebirth, which is how we got Dan Heng, and also how Jing Liu went kinda crazy. But despite this tragic outcome, Dan Feng regrets nothing. He loved his friends more than anything and would have sacrificed anything for them at the time. And in that respect, he is the same as Dan Heng, because Dan Heng would also sacrifice everything for his friends. And speaking of reviving dead things, that is also Geocles' goal. He wants to sacrifice Dan Heng to the Memoria Tide in order to obtain the power of permanence so that he can forge Terravox a great, immortal body of Earth. Honestly, this situation confuses me greatly because Evernight is technically March and she wishes to protect both March and her most beloved companions. So I don't know why she would let this happen unless the whole sacrificing thing wouldn't actually kill Dan Heng. But I digress. Terravox seems to be at peace with his own imminent death and explains that he once sacrificed himself to mend the land because he loved it so much. But Geocles never accepted the fact that Terravox did this out of his own free will, which is why he's acting this way. Dan Heng recognizes Terravox's will to sacrifice everything for the sake of the things he loves and decides then and there to take Terravox's coreflame of Earth and allow the dragon to live alongside of him and walk the path of permanence together. This act allows Dan Heng to finally make make peace with his past self's choices, as he decides to view his history not as something that haunts him, but as a lesson that guides him towards a better future that's made from better choices. And with that, Dan Heng finally enters the maze of time that is the memory zone. He spends an untold amount of time searching for the Trailblazer in there and eventually finds them and pulls them back to Earth. Once the Trailblazer and Dan Heng are fully reunited, they bid farewell to the spirits of Castorus and Hycelins who had been helping them up until this point, and they venture into the tomb where Evernight is supposed to be, which is also apparently underground. And it's in the entrance of this tomb where they see this infinity symbol. And these choices are absolutely frustrating to me because if you say, hey, I've seen this symbol before, it only gives you 3 choices in response, and it completely disregards the fact that this symbol is literally everywhere in Amphoreus. But it's fine, I'm fine. It just annoys me because I asked this exact question during the very first Amphoreus recap video I made, while also going on to theorize about a 13th Titan, which is now relevant because this second mural is that of the 13th Titan, who goes by the name Demiurge. But okay, hold on. Before we proceed with the story, we absolutely have to talk about this whole Demiurge and 13th Titan thing, because it is essentially the everything explanation. So here's the deal. Iron Tomb was originally a complete entity with 4 arms and a head, but you may have noticed that it no longer has a head. That's because during early development, Lygus lopped off its head, which rendered Iron Tomb nothing more than a mindless puppet that Lygus could control because it lacks sentience. But in order for his experiment to proceed as planned, the Scepter needed to believe that the head of Iron Tomb, aka the Demiurge, still existed in some capacity, even if the head was dead. So the Scepter created this great tomb as a placeholder for the missing 13th Titan in order to solve a logical fallacy. Now, the real reason why Lygus needed Iron Tomb to be headless and needed the Scepter to believe that the head existed was because Lygus needed to ensure that Iron Tomb was programmed with an instinct to seek out their missing head. Now remember, Iron Tomb is just a body, and its true purpose is to destroy Nous, which is a disembodied head. So this head-seeking instinct of Iron Tomb would cause it to believe that Nous is its head. So Iron Tomb would hunt Nous down and attach itself to them. And once they were a single unified form, Nous would be corrupted by the anti-life equation that is Iron Tomb and thus guide the universe towards destruction. So this mural is a representation of the head's existence, hence why it has 4 arms. Just like Iron Tomb has 4 arms, and 2 of those arms are cradling the world because it was supposed to have created the world, because that's what a Demiurge does. If you didn't know, a Demiurge in Gnosticism is a false god that created the world after being abandoned by its Aeon mother, Sophia. They're called a false god not because they lack divine powers, but because they are not the monad, or the ultimate true god that exists at the highest seat of authority in all of existence and reality, and beyond reality. So in Star Rail terms, Nous is Sophia, since the Scepter is made out of one of Nous's neurons, and Nous is also an Aeon like Sophia. I think this myth has also been reflected in the symbolism of Kefali, because Kefali is also supposed to be a creation titan, right? And they have 4 arms just like the Demiurge and just like Iron Tomb. 2 of those arms are cradling the Dawn device in the same way that this Demiurge mural is cradling the world. We'll come back to this. But first I need to explain what's inside of this tomb, because it's definitely not empty. In fact, it's the most important location in the entirety of Amphoreus, because this tomb represents the core layer of the Scepter. And within this core layer is a central processing unit called the Demiurge Matrix. This matrix has one job, and that is to record all of the data from every extrapolation experiment, which means it also exists outside of the simulation. So when the eternal recurrence cycles first began and Cyrene was killed by Phynon and thrown outside of Amphoreus' time, she found herself inside of the Demiurge Matrix, and she found a way to make use of it. So at the beginning of every eternal recurrence cycle, Phynon would use Cyrene's ceremonial blade of time that she had infused with her own soul to kill her. And in doing so, he would imbue her with all of the time that he had accumulated within that cycle. The deceased Cyrene, now reverted to a memory, would then take that time, record it as memories in the As I've Written book, and then offer those memories up to the Demiurge Matrix so that they would be preserved. Because otherwise, like, the data in a recursive loop should overwrite itself. And this is only made possible because the first Cyrene modified parts of the Demiurge matrix using the power of Remembrance, and she has that ability because she is the emanator level entity of Remembrance that Black Swan detected on Amphoreus back at the start of the story. She is a child of Fuli, and this makes her and March incredibly special. See, the Garden of Recollection has been harboring an enormous secret this entire time. The Eon of Remembrance, Fuli, shattered once upon a time, and their fragments were littered throughout the universe in the process. Each fragment carried a child of Remembrance, or a child of Anasrava, and one of those fragments became Cyrene, and another became March. So when those memo snatchers that Black Swan encountered claimed they wanted to obtain the moment of an Eon's death and also a seed of remembrance, they were specifically talking about Cyrene, because she would have been born as the result of their Eon's death. And that also makes her a seed of the remembrance, because plants spread seeds when they die. Now, there's a faction within the Garden of Recollection who are trying to collect the children of Anasrava and bring them back to the garden, and I'm pretty sure their leader might also be one of these same children, based on this one comment from the Memo Snatchers. It really sounds like there's this one child of Fuli who's seeking out all of her lost sisters, and that includes March and Cyrene. Now, I'm going to pause my explanation for a moment and continue the story, because this is all stuff that we're mostly finding out as Heng and the Trailblazer make their way through the Great Tomb as they witness the memory echoes of the Cyrenes of past cycles. And we need to get to the climax in order to get the rest of the information. So, after witnessing all of Cyrene's struggles, Heng and the Trailblazer find Evernight waiting for them at the core of the Matrix. And it is here that Evernight declares Fuli lied to Cyrene, giving her hope that Amphoreus could be saved somehow. Evernight is actually quite convinced that Fuli never intended to save Amphoreus, no matter how many times Cyrene offered herself up to it, because that's what she was doing every time she, fed all the memories into the Demiurge Matrix. She was offering herself in the form of memories to the Matrix. In fact, Evernight believes that the Memo Snatchers looked at Iron Tomb as if it was a sort of ark upon which the remembrance could reside and wait until destruction blew the erudition to pieces, at which point Fuli's path of remembrance would devour the path of erudition the same way Harmony devoured order once upon a time. So Evernight believes that if she burns all of these memories instead, then Iron Tomb will have nothing to take root in, and what little bits of Amphoreus are left will be set free. Now, this plan isn't without risk, because setting all of these memories on fire also means setting herself on fire, since she's also just a consciousness trapped inside of the scepter, which is why she was intending to take over Black Swan's Dharmakaya, which means something like a true self, but in Star Rail it's a term used to describe a mimetic entity's form. So she wants to take over Black Swan's body. Evernight doesn't really care about Amphoreus or its so-called AI people that live inside of it. She cares a lot more about thwarting the garden's plans, because March is afraid of the garden, and destroying Amphoreus would halt Iron Tomb, and that feels like a small price to pay for March's continued happiness and security. So she pitches this idea to Heng and the Trailblazer, and even offers them the coreflame of world-bearing, the real one this time, in order to make it happen. They, of course, refuse her offer, and when Evernight presses the issue, Cyrene arrives with March's camera, the one that contains what's left of March. One click of the camera's shutter later, and Evernight finds herself face to face with March and Cyrene. March argues that Evernight has already done everything that she needs to do to protect March and her companions. It's possible to resolve the issues on Amphoreus and outside of it without resorting to such drastic measures as setting an entire planet's memories on fire, because the memories of their journeys are important. They're far too important to throw away so carelessly. And March believes they can save the planet together. Evernight finally concedes and allows March to regain control over their body. And regardless of March's arguments, Evernight is just flat out wrong in her assessment of the situation. Cyrene's efforts over these last 30 million plus cycles weren't for nothing. All of those memories she accumulated, plus Ceredra and Phinon's attempts to rewrite the rules, created an opening for Era Nova to take on a new meaning. So as they initiate Era Nova for real this time, and the Chrysos heirs present their core flames and wishes to the book as I've written, they allow the Cyrenes of every cycle to come together and form the new Demiurge, the new 13th Titan from whom the first soul of the world, the first new spore, emerged from. They used Era Nova to complete Iron Tomb's head, but not its body. And this situation is very thematically fitting because, as I've said in many previous theories and recaps, Cyrene is based off of the Honkai Impact 3rd character, Alicia, who was Hersher number 13 and 0 at the same time, because she represented both the beginning and the end, having been born of the cocoon of finality. This is symbolically important because finality in Star Rail exists at the end of our journey, but also at the beginning of the next journey. That's why the Eon of Finality is named Terminus, as if it were the final train station on the Trailblazer journey. But the last station that you go to is also the first station from which you leave in the morning. It's the beginning and the end. It's the first and the last. It's the Alpha and the Omega. It is finality and origin. And in the same way, Alicia loved humanity so much that she sacrificed herself for their sake while donning a symbolic wedding dress as proof of her love of humanity. So too does Cyrene appear to love Amphoreus so much as to commit herself to protecting its future and its future alone. And as a pure child of remembrance, a fragment of Fuli, she has done what the garden has always believed Fuli would do at the end of the world. She became the deity from whose memories the world was recreated from after Era Nova destroyed the world. The Trailblazer turned her into the Demiurge, the head of Iron Tomb, the creator deity, the other half of the deity of mass destruction. Or at least that's certainly what it seems like to me. And I especially feel that way because we were warped from the great tomb of the 13th Titan to Idis Elysiae, which literally means Temple of Elysia. Since the 13th Titan isn't technically dead anymore, the rebrand kinda checks out. Or maybe you could just argue that the great tomb of the 13th Titan and Idis Elysiae are the same place, but in two different forms. The tomb is the end, but Idis Elysiae is the beginning, because that is where the beginning of every cycle takes place, in Idis Elysiae. And if Cyrene decides to marry the world in the same way Elysia married humanity, then her comments about this whole story being a romantic one become really funny. I mean, she even has a wedding ring. Now, I have a couple of small theories and observations that I want to sort of pitch here because they don't really fit anywhere else, so just stick with me for a second. Something I've been saying since the very beginning of Amphoreus' story is that it's very odd for the Remembrance in particular to be an Amphoreus, given all of these references to myths and legends, because those are things that are associated with Mythos and the Enigmata, not Fuli the Remembrance. But there are little things in this quest that have me convinced that Fuli and Mythos might be the same thing, and I'm not the only theorist who's pitched this idea either. At this point, I'm kind of just adding fuel to that fire. In my opinion, if March is the child of remembrance, she should have remembrance powers, and yet the part of her with the purest powers of remembrance actually exhibits powers of the Enigmata. Both the Reign of Sensation and the power of Oblivion are explicitly enigmatic abilities. Don't even get me started on Evernight's symbolism with the jellyfish and the ink and all that kind of stuff. But this quest has made me wonder if March actually represents Fuli while Evernight represents Mythos. And if they do, then that's more evidence that Fuli and Mythos are the same entity in two different forms. One thing that Evernight kept saying was, for new life to be born, the seed must be dead, which is a phrase that drives me crazy because it is scientifically false. A seed has all of the bits of a plant inside of its casing, which just unfolds during germination. That's not death. A dead seed cannot germinate. That's kind of the point. But I don't think this phrase is actually meant to be viewed scientifically or literally, but instead philosophically, like a seed stops being a seed once it becomes a plant, right? That is a form of death conceptually, but not literally. It's a transformational death, like a caterpillar melting down to become a butterfly. Now, on a related note, in Greek mythology, the Lethe was a river from which the deceased would drink from in order to erase or forget the memories of their previous lives, and the associated deity of the same name governed over the concepts of both forgetting and oblivion. This concept is fairly common in cultures throughout the world, and oftentimes that process of death and forgetting also results in rebirth, or like it's done in preparation for rebirth. So it's considered to be transformational. So the way I see it, that whole seed of remembrance those memo snatchers wanted is something that's meant to be taken literally. March is the seed and Evernight is her plant. March is Fuli and Evernight is Mythos. The two are intertwined, and that's important because I don't even think this idea is limited to March and Evernight. I think it's also representative of Cyrene and Mem, or whatever this new form that Cyrene is taking is. See, Cyrene and Mem are both embodiments of Remembrance, but Evernight and Mem are both embodiments of Mythos. Mythos obscures memories but can also twist them into new forms. So if Evernight is someone who obscures memory through oblivion and the Reign of Sensation, then Mem reshapes them into something new, using the power of, I don't know, what are Mythos's other powers? Morph, screen, riddle, and mirage? Fabricating story, making pure fiction, writing folktales? It fits. And on that same note, we can even look at the relationship between March and the Trailblazer, and Cyrene and Phynon, because those are similar too. Both the Trailblazer and Phynon have seeds of destruction in them, and yet they are considered to be the world bearer. So you remember how I mentioned that Iron Tomb is programmed to seek out its head? It's a body of destruction that's seeking out a head of creation. No matter what form he was in, Phynon was always seeking out Cyrene. He was always destroying her, and he was always clearing the ground for her seeds of remembrance to take root in. Even as Kaslana. Cause Kaslana tried to breach the core layer of the scepter over and over and over again, and what's in the core layer? The Demiurge matrix. That's where Cyrene was going. He was instinctually acting as the body that is Iron Tomb and seeking out the head that is the Demiurge that is Cyrene. Do you see how the themes are theming? We can make the same argument for the Trailblazer and March to an extent. Anyway, I think these relationships are cool, and I wanted to share them. And I think this would be a really good spot to leave the whole video. In fact, this is actually a pretty good spot to just, end the whole story if they had added just like a short little epilogue or something. Because, it's a pretty happy ending, right? Like, we were one cutscene away of Cyrene just like blessing the world and having it come into existence, and the Trailblazer setting off on their next adventure from, the end. But there's still a whole patch to go. And technically, we still haven't dealt with Lygus or any of his shenanigans yet. Iron Tomb is still technically a threat right now. And Lygus seems convinced that nothing we will do will change his outcome of inevitable destruction. Although I do think that Miss Pink Elf over here begs to differ. So I can only assume that the next patch must be dealing with the headless body of Iron Tomb now that Cyrene seems to have taken the place of its head. In other words, she's got to find a way to save Phynon. And actually, I think that's my prediction for the next patch. I think my prediction for the next patch is that Aranova goes through and they have to reconcile how to channel all of this destructive power into something that won't actively harm people, indiscriminately. There is this line that implies that Cyrene believes the world will exist in the form of Iron Tomb. So whatever the case, we're definitely dealing with the fallout of Aranova in the next one. It's not going to be just a simple happy ending. It's going to be a much longer drawn out struggle, I think. And speaking of struggles, it also appears like the next patch might be a prelude to an upcoming intergalactic war, as Black Swan seems to claim at the end of the quest that one of Noose's unavoidable moments is quickly approaching. And those tend to push us closer to finality, or the end of the world as we know it. So that sounds fun. But all right, I think that's all I've got for now. I would like to take this moment to thank you all so much for watching episode 7 of our Amphoreus recap journey, and I sure hope to see you all in our 8th and final episode, which is coming soon. Well, I say final, that's not actually true. There's gonna be one more after that, because once all 8 episodes are in place, I am going to make one video to cover the whole quest in one go. So I guess that will be our semi-final episode. Well, whatever. Until I see you again, take care of yourselves, and bye-bye.